Hi, students. Welcome to video 13 on the human population. The map that you're looking at right now has the world scaled based on population size. So smaller places visually mean that there are less people living there. Larger places mean there's more. So the things that should jump out to you are there are a lot of places in like South America and Africa that don't have as high populations. And then there's these huge chunks over here of China and India that do have huge populations. So kind of an interesting map to look at. So after today, you should be able to discuss factors that can impact birth rates and fertility rates and describe how education and family planning can help decrease the growth rate of the human population. So a question I want you to think about as we go through this unit is what impact will a growing population have on your future? These are questions that we're going to have to figure out answers to because we're going to be having to deal with this in 2050. We're still going to be around, hopefully, and we will have to deal with an increasing population. So by 2050, the population is projected to be 9 billion people. Our current one is 7.4 billion. So those are two numbers that you need to know. Most of the growth is going to occur in developing countries, places like China and India. Most developed countries have already kind of leveled out a little bit. And some questions that we're going to have to be answering is, should the population of the country where we live be stabilized as soon as possible? Meaning, should we implement strategies to stabilize populations? So I started making things red. If it's red, I need you to write it down. If it's black, not necessarily something to write down, but just to kind of pay attention to. So China's one-child policy, you do need to be aware of this policy. They like to ask questions about this on the exam. Just kind of make like 2 sentences or something summary of what's going on. So 1970s, the population was sky high, almost 800 million people in this little bitty area. And the government instituted a one-child policy, which basically made families who had more than one child be taxed heavily. So it was very incentivized to have only one child. We reduced the number of children from 5.7 to 1.5 per woman, so it was very successful. However, the consequences of this is you have a culture where females are not as valued because, people and families want to have male children so their name can be carried on and they can have someone to support them financially later in life. So you got a lot of female infanticide, which is killing female babies because they wanted to have a male baby instead, so they would leave them on the side of the road or they would just drop them off in an orphanage, unfortunately. There's also a black market trade in teenage girls because there are so few women that actually end up in the population. So an update in 2015, they actually abandoned the one-child policy. Now couples can have 2 children, and they did this because they were having a labor shortage. They were having many more older people than they were young people in their population. So looking at India tried the same thing. They had similar planning program put into place. It did not work because it was pretty inefficient. And there's extreme poverty problems in India, and it wasn't very well planned out. There's also a disagreement over how they were actually going to do it. And in India, the large families are very culturally desired. So people did not want to have this one-child policy or a 2-child policy going on. So it really hasn't taken hold in India. So demography, you need to know what that is. It is a study of human populations. We talked about these different things: births, deaths, gender, age, race. These are all things that we can characterize a population on. And then something to be aware of is it took almost 72,000 years to reach 1 billion. So here's 1 billion right here. We reached it in about 1810 or so. And then the next 1 billion, we went from 1 billion to 3 billion. It only took 150 years. So this is exponential growth, J-shaped curve. At 6 billion, from 5 to 6 billion only took 12 years. Now we're over 7 billion, and that took even less. So our growth is continuing to increase, even though in some places we are slowing the growth rate. So a little bit of our history here. Again, J-shaped curve that you need to be aware of. This is early agriculture over here. We were a nomadic society. We were hunters and gatherers about 10,000 years ago. At that 10,000 year mark is when we started to have traditional agriculture, what we would consider farming. So people were now staying in one area. They were not having to travel miles and miles a day looking for food. Up here is when you started having your industrial revolution happen. And you started to get a huge increase in population once we started burning coal and we could feed more people and provide more energy. So technology can greatly increase the carrying capacity. If we did not have technology, our carrying capacity for the world would only be about 1 billion. But because of different technologies with food and things like that, we're able to be where we are. We don't know where the carrying capacity of Earth actually is. It's projected to be anywhere between 1 billion and 33 billion. So there's a lot of people that say that having 7 billion people on the planet is too much. And that's overshooting our carrying capacity because people are not living at a high quality. Not everyone is living like we are in the United States. We know growth can't continue forever, so we have kind of this projection of where we could go. We could keep going with a high projection, or we could sort of level off where we are now. So looking at the current and future world, these are the 10 most populated countries in the world. You need to know the top 3. This is back in 2015, and it is still the case now. China, India, and then the United States. You need to be able to put them in that order. And then looking at the world in 2030, it's going to be flip-flop with India at the top, and then China, and then the US. So you need to be able to do both. China, India, United States right now, and in the future, India, China, and the US. So looking at 2 different worlds that we really have here. We have developing countries, which are very poor, they're very rapidly growing, and we have developed countries which are very wealthy and they're shrinking a lot. So some examples of your developing countries, you need to have some of those in your pocket. India, China, Congo, lots of places in Africa are considered developing. Developed, the US, Japan, France, Germany, all of those places are going to be classified as developed. And this graph over here shows you where the growth is actually projected to be. So these are your developing countries. Most of your growth is going to come from them. And then here's your developed countries. It's kind of they have leveled off some. Looking at some measurements of growth, you need to know these terms. Fertility rate is the number of births per 1,000 women per year. You don't need to know, but just kind of for your information, in developing countries, it's about 20 births per 1,000 women, and in developed, it's about 10, so half that. Total fertility rate, we also call that TFR, is the average number of children a woman will have in her lifetime. And you see in developed countries like the United States, it's very low. It's close to what is the replacement level. And the replacement level is basically how many children do you have to replace yourself. So if it's you and one other person to make a baby, you have to have 2 of those to replace both of you. Now the reason it's 2.1 is because that's including some of the deaths that are happening for people, so it needs to be a little bit higher to account for deaths. So looking at fertility rates of the world, be aware that in Africa is about the highest areas that we have fertility, very high fertility rates, sometimes like 7 to 8 children per woman. And then in developed countries, you have much, much lower. So in areas like the United States, Mexico, it's a lot lower. Australia. Here's the United States. Now, we did have this thing called the baby boom in about from 40 to 60s range. So a lot of your parents might be in that, or grandparents might be in the baby boom age. So it was declining, and then it skyrocketed because of this boom, and then it's kind of gone back to the replacement level that we have. So what are some things that we can do to control population? Because obviously we cannot have just billions and billions of people on the planet, and it continues to go up. Something has to give. We don't have enough resources, enough space. So total fertility rate drops when women gain access to contraceptives, family planning, education. It's really about women with populations. You have to educate women and make them not want to have 8 children. Make it culturally, acceptable to only have 1 or 2 children. So in 2015, 64% of married women or women that were in unions use contraceptives. In China, it's 86% because of that one child policy. In the United States, it's 68%. 20 African nations, though, it's less than 10%. So we really need to get those numbers up if we want to control population numbers and not have issues with that. So here are some more factors that affect birth rates and TFR. What is the cost of raising kids? If it's high, then people are going to have lower or less children. Availability of retirement programs. If you don't need children to take care of you in your old age, then you won't have as many. Urbanization. We talked about education and employment opportunities, not just for women, but for everyone. Number of infants that are dying. If you have a child and it survives past infancy, then you're not going to have as many as if you have one and it dies. You might have another one. Marriage age. Are people getting married in their 20s or are they getting married in their teens? And then availability of contraception and abortions. So if people are on birth control and they know about birth control and they take it, then they don't have to have abortions and they don't have to have children, unwanted children. So TFR for educated versus uneducated women in 6 different countries. It's very, very obvious that people that have a higher education or more education, and we're talking about high school in most of these places, are less likely to have, 4, 5, 6 children than people that are uneducated. Finally, got it out. So these are some family planning ideas and programs that have happened. We've got Iraq versus Iran family planning. So the blue is family planning is accessible, and the red countries are where they are not accessible. So what you see in every single case is that every country that has accessible family planning programs, the fertility rates have declined a lot more than where there's not family planning. So family planning really does work. It educates people about children, raising children, having children. Believe it or not, there are actually places in the world that people don't actually understand how children are born and why they're born. So we need to educate in very basic terms for a lot of cases. And another thing is gender equality. So women lack education and freedom in a lot of places. 2/3 of the world's illiterate people are women, and 60% of people living in poverty are women. And those are the ones that can have babies. So if that's happening and they're not as educated, they're going to have more and more children. If they don't have, as much equality as they need to, and they need children to take care of them later in life, that's one of the reasons they're having children. So what are most of the women in the world doing? Most of the women do the domestic work and childcare. They also provide unpaid health care for especially elderly members of the family or community. They do 2/3 of the work for the world, but only get 10% of its income. So when I say work, I mean like everything. So domestic, healthcare, everything that's happening, farming, all that stuff. And they are, in a lot of countries, very discriminated against legally and culturally. So it is culturally acceptable in a lot of places for women to not be as valued. So looking at opposing factors, there are pronatalist factors, things that will increase your desire for children. You need to be aware and talk about a few of them. So a lot of people think that they are a source of pride and pleasure. They can support you as an elderly person, and they're a source of income. But we do usually have that boys are more valued over girls because of the reasons that boys can make you more money and they can take care of you and still have your name. If you have a female child, she's going to be married off and go and live with her husband and going to be taking care of his family. Antinatalist pressures usually involve women. So these are things about why would we not want to have children. So women are less likely to have kids if they have an education, they have freedom, they have an opportunity to earn a salary and have a job, and their social economic status is higher. So if women are valued in society and they are considered equals, they're not going to be having as many kids because kids do not necessarily get you status, whereas in a lot of countries, children get you status. So a couple of quality of life factors that you need to be aware of. Life expectancy is the average age that you are expected to live in the country where you're born. Infant mortality is the number of deaths of children under 1 per 1,000 live births. And then child mortality is the number of deaths of children under the age of 5 per 1,000 live births. And looking at infant mortality, that's a really important one. That indicates a lot about your society if you have a low infant mortality or a high infant mortality. That tells you a lot about the healthcare of the country, how poor it is, those sorts of things. So here is our world infant mortality. You will notice again, a lot of it is situated right here in Africa, whereas your developed nations have typically a lower infant mortality. So lower children are dying when they're first born. And then here's our life expectancy. Kind of correlates over here. Countries in Africa are below 50 is the age that you're expected to live. It's 76 in the United States. I think it's about 79 for women and 75 for men, something like that. But you'll notice that all of the green areas are developed countries. There are areas that have higher standards of living. All right, that's it. Come